Welcome, guys, to an episode with Doomed Hell. Hope you guys had an amazing weekend. I did. And I stumbled upon a prophetic video that I wanted to make for you guys today. And it was really just out of the blue. It was just looking at the forums, and a guy was talking about potentially upgrading his RAM. Now, this is a pretty famous topic among gamers. A lot of gamers think that if you have bad FPS and you want a quick solution to the problem, put a bit more RAM in your computer and it'll solve it. And, I'm one of the few that has tried it and utterly failed. So, today we're going to get into a more fundamental computer engineering approach to the problem. And we're going to try to understand the difference between latency, bandwidth, and RAM capacity, and kind of understand what are the use cases where putting in more RAM actually does something, and what are the use cases where it really doesn't matter, and your best bet is to upgrade your CPU or maybe your GPU or the whole computer altogether. So, the truth of the matter is you have to understand the dynamics of RAM. Why do we use RAM? What's the point of it? What is RAM? So RAM is quite literally just a bunch of boxes in your computer which have an address and usually a hash code or something like that, and a box containing characters, usually 8 bits. And what happens is the memory is used to put up tasks or applications or operations that the CPU will be working on, and that it needs to save for something else. So, for instance, if the computer, hold on, let me just delete all that. If the computer is doing an operation such as, here we have a bunch of numbers. Let's say there's a number 1 here, and we're doing a plus operation, and here you have the number 2. Then it has to save this into memory, then save this into memory, then apply the plus operation to give you the total. So here you would get 3. So this is how memory works. It's literally saving what your computer is thinking about so that it can continue its operations to create applications. And the RAM is controlled by a controller. The controller determines what addresses you're going to use. It determines where you're going to use it. And for our test case, we have all this RAM, and we have an IMC. An IMC is an integrated memory controller. It's a type of portion of your CPU, let's say like right here, that is specifically made to control your memory, to control your memory within your CPU. And it has existed for quite some time. It has become a lot more complex than back in the day, and it first was released within the Athlon 64 era of CPUs, which was the AM2 and AM2 Plus platform. What happened was, before that, we ran dedicated memory controllers, which were on your motherboard. So it's really important to have a really good motherboard with a really good memory controller so that your CPU could talk to your memory very fast. And what happened was, as a lot of things computer engineers realize, is that if they put the memory controller onto the CPU and put it actually integrated into the architecture, they could actually make it much faster, where it takes a lot less latency between saving something and giving it to your CPU. And that's exactly what they did. So the first word here is latency. Latency is when your integrated memory controller chooses the address that it wants to write. So let's say right here, and it starts writing. That is really what latency is. So latency, you could think of it as the milliseconds or the microseconds between your memory controller talking to your address. So that's pretty much what latency is. It's also when it talks back. It's also when it does a random access where it actually goes through like a different part of the memory, and so on and so forth. It's also when it's writing to different memories all at the same time. And you can sum up all the types of latencies that you would have in your RAM with CAS latency. So cache latency, when you see that, you know that this is the time it takes between your memory controller writing to your RAM. And there's many different cases. So that's why when you look at RAM, you got you'd have with DDR5, you'd have like 40, let's say 44 and 38. And it actually continues this way. But when you look at RAM, you usually have the three first numbers, and that's really the first numbers where it's access for one, access for two boxes, access for random box. That's really what that means, and it's calculated in milliseconds. The more you know, right? So latency is the first portion of the equation. Latency is here. The second portion of the equation is bandwidth. And what bandwidth means is how much can your controller actually write to your RAM. So this is actually limited by how fast your RAM is, because writing onto the memory, when you say, okay, I chose my address, now it's time for me to write what I have in my L3 cache or L2 cache, and it's time for me to dump it into the memory. So bandwidth is really important because it determines how much memory, in gigabit per second, let's say, how much memory could be dumped into your RAM. So if you're doing multiple address write-up and you're looking to dump in a calculation for the next room in a video game, let's say, then it's really important to have a lot of bandwidth so that it's very fast to dump in the RAM or to read up the RAM or whatnot, and make sure that that is at a very fast rate. So actually bandwidth is very easy to explain, right? Lots of things use bandwidth, and that's a very easy way of understanding it. And lastly is the amount, the actual amount of memory that you have. So here we have a 24-bit bus, and that's because we have addresses that have 8 bits, and you have 24 of them. So that's a 24-bit bus, because you can physically, the controller can physically see 24 bits, and it's able to write up to all of those 24 bits. So nowadays RAM is at 64-bit bus. Some server setups have 128-bit buses, but generally speaking, we have a 64-bit bus. And so that's a lot that you could write in, and it's also really efficient at how it writes it. And when you see, for instance, RAM running at, like, let's say 16 gigabytes, it physically has 64 bits of bus width, and so it splits out those gigabytes a lot more evenly within the 64-bit. So per bit, what you're actually running is 16 divided by 64. You're actually running 256 megabytes per bus, per bus width. Sorry. So it's actually really fast to write, but it has low bandwidth per bus. And so now we can kind of understand what's going on. When you're writing, let's say you're writing at 128 gigabytes of memory and you're limited at 64 bits. This is a problem, because if you look at the calculator, you got 128 gigs and you divide it by 64, which means each of these little address actually has 20 megabytes worth of writing. That's a lot. And so what happens is they split it up. They have multiple addresses within the address, which means now you have to make sure that you have an x-axis and a y-axis into your memory controller, which can be pretty complicated, and it could be harder to access it. So now we have other cache latencies that deal with that stuff, where you have two-dimensional RAM setups. You also have ranks of RAMs, which is two different sides of the RAM. You have channels, which allow for the latency to be split up between the RAM more evenly, which means the controller can write different portions of the RAM onto different portions of the cache, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of ways, a lot of tricks to try to figure out how much RAM we can actually run onto your 64-bit bus. But the problem is that even though we have all these tricks, at the end of the day, we're limited by a 64-bit bus, we're limited by the memory controller's speed, the latency, the bandwidth, the gigabytes. Okay? So, let's talk about some cases here. The first case is you have a brand new computer, and this computer is made to run video games. So what's really important? Well, what's important is to understand how much your app is actually going to take in gigabytes. Okay? When you're running in operation mode, how much is your memory controller going to have to write to your memory? That's really what's important. Because let's say your app only needs 5 gigabytes of RAM. Okay? That's an operation that's in operation mode. It's not when you're starting up the game. It's really when you're running the game. It only uses 5 gigabytes of RAM. You saw it in your task manager. Sometimes maybe it's like 5.1 gigabytes, let's say. But it's really important that you have to understand 5 gigabytes, okay? So what happens is we have 5 gigabytes, right? Most computers have between 8 to 16 gigabytes. And so the limitation is not the actual size of the RAM. If you put more RAM, it will not do anything. It will not help you in any way, okay? The second thing is the latency, the speed by which your controller is going to write to your bits, okay? And in this case, if you're running, let's say 8 gigabytes, all right, this is a lot less complexity for writing, because now you could only write, now it's, if you look at the calculator, it's 8 gigabytes divided by 64 bits. So it's only 12 megabytes per memory address. So it's actually very, very low. So actually your latency could be, like virtually speaking, much lower if you're running 8 gigabytes than, let's say, if you're running 16 gigabytes. 16 gigabytes will be twice the amount of address of space within the address, which is harder to write. So theoretically, latency could be much lower if you're running 8 gigabytes. But here's the problem, and this is the real issue when you're talking about these problems. We have to look at the actual RAM that you can get, okay? So let's say, hypothetically, we're running an i5 2500K. Now I know it's a very old CPU, but it's a cool CPU because back when it came out, it had a dual channel, which was practically very old at this point, but it also had dual rank, which is a very cool feature. And it also had quite a lot of cache. It had, I believe it had 4 megabytes of cache. That was very high, and it was very fast cache as well. I could be wrong. It could have been 6. I'm not sure. So it had all these kinds of cool features. And now let's look at the type of RAM that you could put in. So let's say we have 2 types. We have DDR3, 1866, CL9, and we have 2X4 versus DDR3, 1333, CL7, and we have 4X4. Okay? So, how do we know which one is going to be faster? Just by looking at it. Well, it's important to understand the actual speed of the controller. We're not going to know this, usually. What we have to do is we have to look at benchmarks. So if the controller, we determine that the latency it's a little latency bound, which means that running CL9 is actually going to affect it more than if you ran it CL7, then it might be that this is the better RAM. But since most games, or since your game's library will never use more than 5 gigabytes of RAM while you're running your application, then maybe this is a better setup because you have more bandwidth. So if, for instance, the IMC accesses the memory at a relatively fast time, then your actual bottleneck may be the actual bandwidth of your RAM. And in this case, this is quite a difference. So you see, in this case, when you're running an application of only 5 gigabytes, it's the case that running this memory, even though the latency is quite a bit larger, that actually this memory may be beneficial for you. Because in this kit, it actually doesn't make sense to run 4x4. The more RAM slots that are filled, the more complexity it is for the memory controller to access. Because it no longer has to access just one address bus. It has to access one address bus on 2 channels double times. So this is actually a complexity that is not in our advantage. So that is your first case. In this case, it's only 5 gigabytes. Now let me give you a case that actually happened to me. So I was running Warzone, and Warzone was eating up 9 gigabytes of RAM. And I had 16 gigabytes, but it was 4x4, and it was really bad kit. I believe I was running CL11, and it was 1333. It was really bad RAM. It was actually ECC RAM. In this case, I was limited by bandwidth and by latency, and I was limited by the amount of the RAM setup I had. And what I ended up doing was I changed this, and I went for a more conventional setup. I went 2x8 gigabytes. Okay, it's fine because we only need 9. And then I ran 2133, and I ran CL11. And in this case, the CPU really liked that, the controller really liked that, and I was able to run Warzone at a much better FPS. So how come? Well, it's mostly because we overclocked the RAM. It's mostly because we simplified the actual setup. It was 8 gigabytes dual rank, and so when running the game, it was much easier for the memory controller to actually access all that memory. And another thing I want to add is that if you are overclocking or if you are putting a lot of RAM, right now I have a setup, it's 8x8 gigabytes of RAM. And what happens is, because it is so much memory, it actually overflows the memory controller. And so that's when I get crashes. Another example is when X99 had just come out. So X99, such as the i7 5820K, these CPUs had a lot of cores. They didn't overclock so good, but they made up for running DDR4, right? Well, actually, the first gen of DDR4, the memory controllers were so weak that you could not run DDR4 at anything higher than 2800 megahertz for the most part. And your cache latency was much worse. We're talking CL16 to CL18. So in these cases, your DDR3 was much better because, again, you were running a bit better bandwidth, but you were running much worse cache latency and a controller that was a lot weaker, where when you were running it in 2x8 or 4x8, you were getting only slight advantages. And also, X99 was really famous for having huge RAM crashes, where if you even overclocked the RAM a little bit too much, it would crash right away. There was no real benefit of running your RAM overclock because of that. So now let's talk about DDR4 versus DDR5. So the real thing with DDR5, the real benefit is that you get a lot more bandwidth, a lot more gigabytes as well. So now you can run DDR5 8000 megahertz, and you can run like 48 gigabytes of RAM, and it's almost the same price as back in the day when you had a 32 gigabyte kit at only, let's say, 3800 megahertz. So it's more than double the bandwidth, and it's more than double the RAM. But then the problem is your latency. Your latency with DDR5, especially when you go anything over 16 gigabyte per stick, goes way through the roof, CL40, versus this kit would have been, CL16 if you were really unlucky, and then CL14 if you were really lucky. So that's a real issue. And on top of that, running DDR5 8000 on, say, like Radeon, it's always been a pain in the ass. So this is where the argument actually matters. You make a quick calculation. If you're running an i7 12700K, and you're running games like such as CS2, Dota 2, and Siege, let's say, this game takes 4 gigabytes, this game takes 2 gigabytes, and this game might take 8 gigabytes if you're really unlucky. Now I ask you, okay, well, what RAM are you going to use here, right? You have your limitations of gigabytes. You're never going to go over 8 gigabytes. So now it's just a question of what the IMC can handle. So we want to maximize the bandwidth such that our latency is very low. Well, in this case, if you're running DDR4 4000 and you're running a CL14, then you're probably going to maximize the actual throughput, the FPS that you're going to get. And so this is why DDR5 is bad. If I wanted to reproduce the same thing with DDR5, the problem would be still latency. So if, say, like Siege is kind of latency bound, where we realize that like anything over CL22 is just terrible for Siege, then in this case it would be a really bad idea to go DDR5. However, the memory controllers have gotten pretty sophisticated, where a lot of the latency between the RAM and the memory controller has been mitigated by the fact that now we have, like, for instance, memory controllers that are able to use the cache to actually cache up virtual RAM onto the chip. Or for instance, we're able to pack it onto the very first bit of the address a lot more information, such that the latency doesn't really affect it anymore, because we don't have to write on a two-dimensional field. So these kinds of solutions actually cause it so that, well, we can run the latency at like 38 for instance, you know, and this is almost the same as if you were running it at CL18 or CL19. So in that case, it actually makes a lot of sense to run DDR5, because you're really not going to mitigate, like, a lot of the issue is just mitigating that latency, making sure those games are actually running with that latency mistake that you would have. And so if the memory controller can eat up all that latency and not really have to deal with any of the application issues, then in fact it's not a big deal. So this is kind of a rundown of what I'm talking about, where running, you know, if you want to maximize bandwidth, for instance in server cases, then gigabytes in bandwidth is what you're going to want. But the truth is that most games are going to want latency and bandwidth, and this is something that DDR5 is kind of suffering right now, but in the future might not suffer at all. And this is exactly what happened with DDR4 and DDR3. So it's not like, it's a long-term forgotten problem. It is still going to be very relevant. But yeah, that's pretty much it. This is like a fundamental understanding of how RAM works. I hope you guys enjoyed this little video here, and have a good day.